When we talk about remote management, we're talking about the ability to use administrative tools and connect to a remote machine. Well, that's still a little vague because there are actually multiple ways in which we can handle remote management in Windows 10. One is RPC, okay, the remote procedure call. We've mentioned the vast majority of your MMC consoles will use RPC in order to make a connection. It does require the RPC as well as the RPC endpoint mapper services, but these are services that are turned on by default in Windows 10. These are port numbers that are open, at least on the internal network. You're not going to be going through firewalls without some configuration, but on the internal network, everything should be okay. Now, it does require, if you're wanting to manage other clients or servers, it is going to require some firewall rules to be open. Firewall rules for the event logs, firewall rules for scheduled tasks, for services, for volumes, for disk management, and for the Windows firewall. And so we have to go in and turn those on if, in fact, we want remote management. Now, if we're just talking about one machine, we'll use the local Windows firewall with advanced security snap-in. If we're talking about multiple machines, it's going to be much easier to use group policy because you'll have the ability to create the same rules in group policy, but it will apply them across multiple systems. There's another method for remote management. It's called WinRM, which is the Remote Management Service. This is not used by MMC consoles. This is used primarily by PowerShell remoting. And we're going to spend some time here shortly going through Windows PowerShell and giving you kind of all the ins and outs of how that's used. But that's where it's predominantly used. Incidentally, this is actually configured by default on servers. And so it is used by the server manager snap-in in Windows Server 2008 and later, and in 2012 and later, remote management is turned on. Okay, so I can actually add the server manager console and point the server manager console at a remote server, and if I have admin rights, it'll be set up and ready to go. On clients, this is not turned on by default. You would run the WinRM quick config command to turn it on. Okay, you could say WinRM QC as well, and that will turn on a listener on port 5985, and that will open the appropriate firewall ports so that you can run predominantly it would be for PowerShell scripts being run against that local machine. Two other remote management options exist in Windows 10, and these really are the ones that we often think of. You know, when you say remote management, the first thing that pops into the mind of many is remote desktop. A remote desktop is a remote management. In fact, it is a remote control mechanism. It allows me to log on to a remote computer and be able to perform anything that I might be able to perform while sitting at that local computer. There are a couple of exceptions to that statement, but about 99.9% of what you could do if you were sitting at it locally, you can do via remote desktop. And so it is a very, very beneficial method of remote management. It is one, though, that is not enabled by default, so you have to turn it on in the system properties. When you turn it on, you have the option of enabling all types of connections, including legacy, or only network level authentication. This was a potential issue in the past, but network level authentication is technically supported on XP Service Pack 3 and later, so you should always choose that option at this point, because the reason it's more secure is it forces the user to authenticate themselves before actually accepting the connection on the remote computer. In the old days, you would make a connection to the remote computer, you'd be looking at the login screen of the remote computer having not identified yourself at all. And so network level authentication authenticates earlier, and that's more secure. There are multiple connection options that are a part of the remote desktop client that are important to understand. And it's also important to understand that on a client, remote desktop only supports one login at a time. If you have a server that's running remote desktop services, it's going to support any number of connections based on hardware. If you have a server that's not running remote desktop services, it still is going to allow two simultaneous connections to the server. So the client is just a little different. And then the fourth and last remote management option is remote assistance. And remote assistance provides remote control capabilities, but it's a little bit different. This is primarily for help desk scenarios. It would allow a helper to either offer assistance or to respond to user requests. So a user can make a request for assistance, the helper responds, and when the helper responds, they get a shared desktop with the user along with a chat window that provides communication between the two. Okay? With remote desktop, I'm remotely controlling and it's logging anybody out who's sitting at the computer, if there's anybody there. With remote assistance, I'm connecting. The person sitting at the computer has to accept my connection. We communicate. If I want to try to take control, I have to request it. The user has to accept it again, and I can walk the user through a particular process or show them a file, or something like that. Okay, and so remote assistance is on by default, and it is primarily for the purposes of help desk support style scenarios. All right, so let's take a look at these remote management tools here. I'm going to go into Control Panel and System and Security, and then the Firewall is where we want to go. Okay, so Firewall and Advanced Settings. And I'm going to go to Inbound Rules, and what we're going to see, and I mean these are all the rules. I'm actually going to filter by state. I only want to see the disabled rules because that's going to cut down on the number. And what you're going to find is a lot of this remote administration, it's not turned on by default. Okay, let's say I want to filter by profile, and I'm in currently the private, no, I'm on a public, according to this. So we'll filter by public. All right, by public and then disabled. And so what I'm seeing here then is remote desktop turned on or off. That's not enabled. Remote event log management, remote scheduled task, remote service management. This is the remote firewall management. Okay. So all of this stuff and remote administration in general is not turned on. And if you wanted it to be turned on, then you would just highlight it and enable it, okay? Now there's actually an easier way of doing it, and the easier way of doing it is going over here and saying you want to allow an app or a feature through the firewall. And then we would just scroll down and we would find remote management. So remote desktop, we would check the box, we would check those if we wanted to allow, that type of access. Okay? That's easier because sometimes there's 2, 3, or more individual rules that make up that category. So that's kind of the simpler view of it. All right, so that would turn it on. Now you would have to go to the system properties and the remote settings button here in order to turn on remote desktop. Okay, notice remote assistance is automatically turned on, but remote desktop is not. So we want to allow remote connections, and we generally always want to leave that checkbox checked. That will use network level authentication. Administrators will be able to connect by default. So anybody in the administrators group is able to connect, and then you can add in additional users. That turns it on and opens up the firewall on this machine. Let's use remote desktop here. MSTSC is the name of it, or remote desktop. Okay, the remote desktop connection. And then we are going to plug in the name of the computer that we're connecting to and a username. We can show some additional options here. You can choose to be able to save the credentials, but I do want to go through these other options. So this is going to be the display, that you want when you're connecting, the colors, local resources, how do you want the audio, the keyboard to work. On the audio, it's, do you want to play sounds on this computer or the remote computer? Do you want to do recording? A lot of times that doesn't matter. Keyboard shortcuts can matter, just makes it more usable. By default, it's connecting printers and your clipboard, which allows you to copy and paste between yourself and the remote system. You can also connect drives if you'd like. Okay? And so we can choose to do that. That gives you a little bit more of a full-featured experience, and then the performance is going to be determined automatically. You can specify other options, and it just turns various things off, but usually detecting it works fine. And then over on the Advanced tab, there is this option to connect from anywhere through an RD gateway server. If you think about this, this works fine on an internal network because you're not going through a firewall, or you going through the host firewall, but enabling remote desktop enables the rule to allow that traffic. But if I'm from, if I want to give access to users from their home to their desktop, then it's going to be different because they actually have to be hitting a server with a public IP address, and that server has to know where to direct them. Well, that server is known as a remote desktop gateway server. So if you have that scenario, somebody has to put in the public server name like rd.knockerball.com, something like that, and that's where they're going, and then that server has a policy that determines exactly which internal machines they're going to be able to get to, okay? So those are settings that you would do out here. Over here, I would be plugging the internal name or the internal IP address, but I'm basically specifying that we're going to go through this gateway. It's acting almost like a reverse proxy server, okay? So we're going to say connect. Don't ask me if I trust this connection again. This is how I want to log in. Once again, this is the warning about the certificate. This is the remote desktop protocol, I should say. It's operating on port 3389. It is encrypted by default, okay? And so it's encrypted via this certificate for that remote system, but it's a self-signed certificate that we don't really trust, okay? So now I'm connected to that remote server. This is just our domain controller that's running Windows Server 2012, all right? So that shows you that if I want remote assistance, okay, allow remote assistance to be sent from this computer. That gets me into the settings. And let's see, ask someone for help. that could get me whatever from the web. Okay, so the remote assistance option is a little bit more difficult to get to. Thought here. Let's go back to system properties. You go into advanced, you can set limits for this, by the way, hours, and allowing the system to be controlled remotely. You can click there and it'll show you, what's going to happen. So, and then we can, the helpers can actually offer assistance as well. All right, and so we'll close those down. The way that you are going to, the other way that this can be done, I should say, is we could, MSRA was the way of looking at the Microsoft Remote Assistant. So they have made that a little bit more difficult, and they've only got the file name in there. So you can either just type it in there and click it, and then there's Windows Remote Assistance, and you can ask somebody to help, invite someone you trust to help you, send the invitation as a file, it saves it, I assign a password, and then I would invite it. I'm not going to go through that whole thing anyway of making the connection. This is not changed in Windows 10 other than they've made it a little bit more difficult to get to. And so then an individual who's been invited is going to go and say, I want to help somebody who's invited me. This is the invitation file that I want to use. If there's a password set for it, they'll have to type in the password, and then they would make that remote connection. So say the other thing you can do is just go run an MSRA, and it opens up the Windows Remote Assistance. But that part, they have made a little bit more difficult to get to. In my experience, that one of all the ones that we've talked about is probably the least useful anyway, or the least used, because often companies already have third-party remote control sharing type of software like VNC or something that allows their help desk to do that, okay? So we want to know that these remote management options exist. We want to know how to go in, turn them on, configure, and use them to connect to remote machines that are running Windows 10.